Exploration is probably the most overlooked pillar of D&D. So my question to you is, what is the purpose of exploration in your D&D games? Does it serve as means of reaching the plot, or more about the discovery element of the setting? AJ, what is your take on that?
I love exploration. It's my favorite part of the game, particularly hex crawls, old style hex crawls. Hex crawls, for those of you who don't know, when you have a map with a hex grid on it, and each of the hex grids represents a certain area, just like in a dungeon, but it's usually a much larger scale, like 24 miles or something like that. Usually a hex would represent like a day's travel for your characters that are on foot in older campaigns. And you can have campaigns which are entirely like that. Like you could even do that in the Forgotten Realms. Just don't explain that your characters are in the Forgotten Realms and they don't know where they are, and they discover it as they travel. Like that's particularly good if it's a Spelljammer game or something like that. They just crash landed somewhere. Turns out it's Torrell. They've never been there before. And now you're describing it to them bit by bit. And they're exploring it and discovering it. And then the penny drops. Oh, this is Luskin. We're in the Forgotten Realms. We didn't even know. So it gives you the opportunity as a dungeon master to unveil the story organically, and they discover things. And just like it, why do you go out into the wilderness? To see new things, to unveil things, to have that unknown and the experience of it. So I really love that. Also, it's not just territory that you're exploring, it's also discoveries in the social aspect of the game. What are the alliances? What are they up to? Who are the harpers? Like there's a lot of factions and things that your characters don't know about, and you don't have to explain these things right at the start of the game. So it could be that there's doppelgangers or vampires at play and nobody knows what their plots are, but your characters are slowly discovering these incremental discoveries, and oh, whoa, there's this big conspiracy and I know about it, but nobody else does. Nobody believes me. And these guys are now working against my character and destroying my reputation. So I could actually end up a criminal locked away, railing against the, like, you don't know, they're taking over the kingdom. And yeah, it's my favorite aspect of the game.
That's incredible. And yeah, I think I figure that, there's combat, there's social interaction. These are pretty clear. We can think about the scenes that kind of involve that. The rest is exploration, right? Everything that doesn't fall under these two is
Yeah,
exploration, and
it
that really
ties.
defines everything else. It
Yeah,
ties
it
everything
ties
together.
it. It's an ingredient of the recipe of Dungeons and Dragons. If you leave it out, it's like there's no salt in this meal. It's meh.
Yep, absolutely. Fred, what do you think about that?
It's funny that you talk about exploration and its purpose in Dungeons and Dragons, because I think actually a lot of people think that Dungeons and Dragons, the most important aspect out of the three pillars is combat, but actually I think it's actually exploration is the most important aspect of the game. And certainly if you go right back in the history, the history of Dungeons and Dragons, how it was played and what the sort of adventures they built and how they were built, very much the focus was exploration and discovery. So for me, since I decided that I needed to sort of find my roots and understand all that sort of stuff, I'm pretty big on exploration and discovery. So for me, exploration can carry the adventure or story forward, sideways, backwards. I don't really give a toss as long as we're not standing still. Standing still is like, it's like going to the dentist and you know that you're going to be getting your wisdom teeth taken out. It's not a pleasant experience. So as a general rule, I prefer to be moving in some direction. I just don't care which direction with the exploration. I also think that it makes a good way to explore the environment and the world and how it works and all of the monsters and NPCs and cultures that are there, just like AJ said. But it's also, and this is why should you explore? Is it because of all those other things? There's actually a giant aspect to Dungeons and Dragons in terms of exploration. And it's a reward system, because if you are a player running a character and you search the entire dungeon, if you're in a dungeon, or the world that you're exploring, that means more gold, and more magic items, and more clues as to what I'm supposed to be doing next, and more contacts, and more fun, more monsters, more. It just gives you more. Exploration just gives you more. And I wanted to give you an example of exploration. I ran a one shot and I based it on Barsoom, which is John Carter from Mars, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that particular individual or book. So Edgar's got, basically it said, like, oh, you know, I can do fantasy and science fiction. I don't know what the big deal is. And so I took a lot of those elements. And for those of you who are unaware, Star Wars, Lucas took a lot of his stuff from from Edgar Rice Burroughs' stuff, and he actually put it into Star Wars. Okay, literally like whole names just duplicated completely. So I decided I would create a world that was a red planet, and my players were in the middle of this place. They don't really know very much, and they come across some ruins, and they explore those ruins, and they realize that there's a lot of, you know, there's dead individuals in here, and it's got a strange layout. It seems to be sort of almost circular in nature. It's got technology in it. Like, what's the deal here? Because, you know, we're playing in a medieval campaign, bloody. Ultimately, in the end, it took them a little while to realize they were exploring the Millennium Falcon, and the bodies they were finding were Han Solo, Leia, Luke Skywalker, Chewbacca, and there was a bunch of droids in there that were badly rusted, pulling apart. And that was the reveal at the end of that particular one shot. And so I can tell you,
there's a Quaggas with a crossbow.
They were so shocked. It was not at a character level. It was definitely at a player level. And like, I mean, yeah. So exploration's fundamental in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, we've got Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. It was exploring a giant spaceship. That's one of the most classic Dungeons and Dragons adventures you can have. So it was built into, like, space weirdness was built into Dungeons and Dragons by the creator of the game. That's so true. Don't argue to me that it has no place in the game. It might have no place in your campaign. That's fine. But the lore of Dungeons and Dragons argues differently, and I've made many videos in that regard. Just an addendum to that. With exploration and unveiling new plots and things like that, your characters don't necessarily need to have motivation handed to them. Like, they don't need to, like, have you ever had, Fred, in a situation where the player said, why does my character want to go and do that?
I have had people say that, but then I've had players who said, you don't have to explain to me why I need to go and do that.
Yeah, I've had situations where, like, Expedition, Haunted Halls of Evening Star. If you run that adventure for modern players, there's no actual clue as to why they would go to the Haunted Halls of Evening Star and investigate that dungeon. There's nothing like attacking the town or anything in there. It's just like, oh, there's a dungeon over there. And back in the day, everybody was just like, right, let's go.
That's enough.
My character's an adventurer. Let's go on an adventure. But
that's what we do.
Like, why would my character do this? It's like, because
gold and magic items.
Game,
I guess.
Yeah, with all the other adventurers making, like, either not returning or making a whole lot of gold and magic items. So, you know, may as well.
Anybody who's a working class adult and they come out of the adventure, and then the local lord comes up and says, right, time to collect our tax from that. It's like, huh? Now the gold's exciting.
Excuse me.
Yeah, well, 15% of that is ours, because technically this dungeon is on the crown land.
Yeah, that's the fastest
like,
way.
Don't tread on me.
That's the fastest way to lose your position, is trying to take money out of adventurers.
Yeah.
That's how you
just
lose your
the
barony.
Don't Tread on Me flag, but with like a behir or something instead of a snake.
Yeah.
There's an old comic about this. I don't remember who it was. This is a little bit tangential, but I promise this will be very short. Where the whole thing was about an economancer and he like it was a former adventurer, and he like spent all his money building up the town and like destroyed the town's economy. Like a loaf of bread was like 100 gold pieces or whatever, because he introduced all this stuff, so the party had to come in, and like that was the adventure, was like solving this overinflated economy. It's really stupid, but anyway, exploration, I agree, I think is one of, if not the most important part of the game, because it's like you said, Fred, it's kind of like the glue that sticks everything together, right? Like your boss fights and your dungeons and your roleplay scenarios and everything, none of that matters if like the world doesn't exist. So it's definitely a really understated part of the game, but I think it's important whether we realize it or not. And I pretty much, I think you guys covered most of the points about exploration and why it's valuable. So I'll just leave you with a bit of a tale here. This is something you can maybe try. I years ago was part of a West Marches campaign that we did online. So it was on a Discord server.
And we had what is a West Marches campaign for those of you who don't know what that is?
That's a great question, AJ. A West Marches campaign is where you have multiple DMs and like a bunch of players, and the whole idea is you're all kind of existing in the same world, and you have like your town, which is like your center. All the players and their adventures are there, and a DM can be like, hey, I'm going to run this adventure. And then whichever players can show up to that game session, show up and they go do it. So it's kind of like a shared D&D game with a bunch of people. Typically a West Marches campaign usually have like a couple DMs and like a dozen or so players. So it's like, hey, we're going to meet at my house on Friday. Whoever can show up, shows up and plays D&D. And you kind of usually have overall arcing story beats that people keep up with, but there's more room for smaller stories. We did a version of that on a Discord server, which there was about a dozen DMs and like 130 players. And it was one of the coolest D&D experiences I've ever had in my life, but it was also wild. Like organizing that was a full-time job, straight up. Like we were all doing this. Like I was working at the airport at the time, and I remember being there at like 4 a.m. between flights, like and talking with the other DMs, like developing plot lines and stuff. Like it was the whole thing. But the premise, it was very much inspired by the adventure Keep on the Borderlands, which the whole idea is like you have your safe spot, which in that adventure is the Keep on the Borderlands. We had created this small town, which we called Haven, which was basically a new town on a new frontier in a whole unexplored world. Like no one knew what was out here. There was monsters, there was ancient temples, all that kind of stuff. And the players were all basically adventurers coming from the old world who landed in this little town to like stake their claim. And we had built this huge map that like we weren't using hexes because it was all based in Roll20 and you can like measure miles and stuff. But we had this huge map that like talking in real terms was like probably 200 miles wide. Like it was huge. And we plopped that down in Roll20 and it was all there. And we put that on the DM layer. So all the DMs could see that. And then we had the player version of that map, which was completely blank. And we had plugged it in. This was a very, very, very meticulous process. We had plugged it in such a way so all the little assets, like the marker for ruins, this is a forest, were all individual items. So what would happen is the players were in their first location and they could explore. Say they went north. The DM who was running that game could add the things they discovered to the player layer. So that way the players were like mapping out this new world, basically, is what the idea was. So they would finish the adventure and come back to town, and then they would post screenshots of the stuff that they had mapped out, and everyone would be like, oh, that's so interesting. And what happened was whenever someone made a new character, we had a huge list of these plot hooks. And we would give that new character one plot hook from the whole master list in the DM folder. And be like, this is a rumor that you know. So your player might know like, oh, there's an abandoned temple that supposedly has like a powerful magic item in it to the north. That's what they know. Another player might find something else that has like a map to some type of temple, and those two players might be like, oh, that could be related to my thing. Let's group up. And then they would reach out to the DM folder that we had basically and be like, hey, we want to go do this. And then as the DM group, we would figure out who was going to run that and then go. It was a wild experience. It ultimately got so big and like became way too much to manage that we just started over. And we're like, cool, that was really fun. We're doing the same thing again. And like, you know, people kind of came and went, and I haven't done that for a while, but I think that group is still playing together now. And it was wild, man. Like the exploration element in and of itself became so fascinating because players would go to a thing and they'd be like at the location for the adventure they were going to be there for. And then they would see like a tower or something off in the distance and be like, I wonder what that is. Like, we don't really have time or the preparations to go do it, but maybe we can go and chart that out. And they would go and not even go into that dungeon, but like scope it out and then come back to town and be like, we found this weird tower and there were like Ettins walking around outside and stuff. And then someone else would be like, oh, let's go investigate that. Like, that could be related to my thing. So point being, exploration is awesome. And having a map your players can like discover is such a cool thing. And I mean, that's not necessarily viable for every campaign. And obviously not every campaign is a West Marches game like that, but just having a map for your players to discover is awesome. And if you don't want to take the time to make this whole map that they can discover, you can let the players fill it in as they go. I've also done that where I said, okay, here's your map of the world. This is the town we're starting in. And as the players move out, they got to fill in the map themselves. Like, you're making this map, I'm not doing it. I know Fred said that's an approach to world building he takes in the past.
Yeah.
And it works. When you tell your players like, oh yeah, there's a thing here, and then they go, oh, okay, cool, and then they get to add it to the map, it makes them feel like explorers, and it makes them feel like, oh, this is a thing that like maybe some other people don't know about or whatever. And yeah, I don't know. Exploration's awesome, and giving your players the chance to feel like they're actually exploring and finding things that no one's ever found before can be really fun.
Yeah, I love the idea of one adventuring group in a West Marches campaign who leave a notice on the town notice board, which is a hook to another adventure. It could be a setup, you know, it's like, oh, let's get them to go into it first and see what happens.
That's exactly it. And sometimes there would be dungeons where like someone would, like the party would go in and one of the players would get killed by like a beholder or something. And they'd be like, oh man, we are not meant to be here. And they would go back to town and be like, there's a beholder in this dungeon. It's super dangerous. And then like some of the other higher level characters might be like, okay, like this is something we might be able to take down. And now suddenly you have everyone talking about how to get rid of this beholder, both the players who are actually going to go on the expedition, but then other players who are like, oh, you guys should try doing this, or like, oh, I know so and so has like Revivify, make sure that you bring them with you, like whatever. It was such a bizarre collaborative experience in a way that it was completely unsustainable, but it was so fun while we were doing it. And like if you ever get a chance to play in a West Marches game, do it. It is a truly unique experience to the game, and it can be a lot of fun.
All the resources.
Between an ultimate railroad and an ultimate sandbox. So I feel like West Marches game lean heavily towards the sandbox, and
oh yeah.
I imagine, you know, it could be quite hilarious to find a dungeon and realize that another party has already discovered the dungeon and see like they took everything, you just arrive when it's empty, and like, damn, we missed it, they arrived before us. We actually have competitions between adventuring parties who can get to the location first.
Totally. That kind of stuff used to happen, which was the crazy thing. And like you had people who would get to a certain level and like retire their character, so to speak, because they wanted to like roll up a rogue or something, but their character still lived in town and would become an NPC, and they still had all their abilities and stuff. So this became something that people realized early on. And one of the first big goals was, okay, we need to get like a cleric of level like 8 at least in town so we can get like resurrection cast on people and stuff. So there was a guy who was rolling up a cleric. He was rolling a life cleric for exactly the purpose of getting him to a point where he had access to those spells, and then he was going to retire him and be like, okay, he just like works for the church now.
He's now a bishop, and yeah,
and it became this whole thing where other players were like going on expeditions with him and like trying to protect him as best as they could so that he could like learn the secrets of resurrection, until eventually he was able to do it. He was like, cool, I'm a rogue now, I make my new character. And then that dude just lived at the temple in town, and people would just like dump diamonds there so that whenever someone died they could try to use that to bring them back.
Who's the leader of this religion? Oh, that's Borto Nut Puncher the Third. He's a retired adventurer. He's very
exactly.
understanding of your plight. Yeah, it's like, oh, what did you do? Lost
That
an
was
arm, huh?
that.
Yeah,
That
I
was what
see this.
became so
I've lost
cool,
this one
though.
5 times.
That was something that became so cool, though, was that like in a situation like that, you have the town itself was mostly empty. There were like 3 NPCs that was basically just like, you know, it was assumed there were commoners around, and there was like the mayor of the town, and that was it. We had guilds that were all created by players. I before I was DMing in that game, I was part of a paladin guild that we called First Light, where we basically, it was all the paladins that were in the game. There was like 9 of us, and we made like an order of knights. And we had this thing where everyone had a ring that was like their sign of being in the order. And if that character died, the ring was saved and their name was engraved on it, and then that would get passed on to the next paladin that would join the order. So like you had characters who had rings with like 7 or 8 names on them, stretching back to like when the game first started, of like all these previous paladins and stuff. It was cool, man. Like players will always come up with more interesting world building stuff, especially when you like hive mind it like that, because then the things that become popular are the things that people are just drawn to. You don't have to do the guesswork of like, oh, is this cool? Is this not cool? It's just like, if it's cool, people will just propagate it. Like, you know.
Yeah,
exploration is cool. Nope.
So I feel like everything you've said is incredible, and exploration is definitely, it's easy to overlook when you start, because it's everywhere. The act of being in that fantasy world, of feeling like you're in that fantasy world, the entire immersive experience, in a sense, is exploring the idea of being there, of that world being possible, and interacting with it and seeing what could happen. So that's a huge thing for generally, I think, all tabletop games, not just D&D. It's like something that's we do when we role play. Even the most basic loop of role playing games, like I'm playing that character, I'm doing something, telling the GM or DM or MC or whatever what I'm going to do, and expect something to happen or to learn something about the world. That's exploration right there. So
we're not just exploring the world, we're also exploring your characters.
Absolutely.
Totally.
And that's easy to overlook, but important to remember.
That's a really good point, actually, because like whenever your players do something and the outcome is different than they expect it to be, like that is exploration, because you're informing them the rules of your world, right? Like, not to get way too into it, but we kind of talked about this in a different one when it came to how death works in Theros, right? Like if you're playing on a world like Theros and someone dies and you try to resurrect them, and like that works differently, and you suddenly have the god of death being like, give me a reason why I should release this person's soul, that's different than the way it usually works, right? So like that is in a way exploration, because the players are kind of learning more about the setting, which is cool.
Yeah.
Dragon Ball Z. I mean, how many times does Goku end up like in the afterlife, and it's just like, oh, I'm dead now. You can see I've got a little halo. It's like,
oh, you again?
Not really. Yeah, it's like, well, you're still here. It's like, what's going on?
I'm just dead. It's good though.
Yeah, I'm just dead, but I just live on another plane of existence. It's like, come on back and meet them.
And that's it for this video. Thank you everyone for joining us and for this lovely chat. Again, let's go around and everyone tell us where we can find you and on the internets. So Fred, tell us where we can find you.
Well, you can find me on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook under How to D&D. You probably might find me under Frederick Wheeler on Twitter. I don't know how it sort of lists me, but yeah, those are the places.
Awesome. Josiah, back to you.
Yeah, if you search Dungeon Dad on YouTube, you'll find me. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit.
Awesome. And AJ, where can we find you again?
Yep, you can find me on YouTube. Just type in AJ Pickett and you'll find all of my content. You can also find me on Facebook if anybody still uses it. I admin a bunch of groups that are all started with Sages of, and then the specific world setting. So Sages of Forgotten Realms is one of our biggest ones. We do Eberron, Birthright, all sorts of different stuff, and they're really good communities that focus on the lore of the game. So if you want to learn about it without all the politics and that sort of stuff, we basically stick to the scholarship.
Oh, a lot of good things in there. So thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember that you are awesome. Keep being awesome, and we'll see you beyond the screen. Bye.